Story number 1. A bit of backstory. This happened when I was 16 and still in high school. In order for me to get home, I had to follow an old country road where the school bus didn't go down. It kind of was a T-junction, or whatever it's called, and was bordered on all three sides by this huge forest. My pa owned a small 3-man lumber mill and corn farm, which was pretty neat. Anyhows, onto the story. I was coming home from school one day and cause it's winter it got darklit. So I am not afraid of the dark, and I ain't afraid of the forest surrounding my home, but put two together and you can guess how terrifying that could be. Now, you need to know that 4th year leading up to the incident, we'd been getting a lot of strange issues that had my dad spooked. Several deer had been found dead, gutted and skinned near the farm. He'd grown up on the farm and knew everything about the forest, or so he thought. Bobcats, coyotes and even Bigfoot wouldn't scare him off if you know what I mean. But he didn't think it was anything unnatural, just some poachers who would come and go. But he was about to be proven wrong. I was halfway home when I got a strange sensation of being followed. So I stopped and looked to me right to see a deer just standing there, looking right at me. If you know anything about deer, then you know how strange this is. I shouted at it, expecting it to run away as deer often do, but it had other ideas. Instead of fleeing, it simply shouted back at me, in my own voice. I didn't waste another second before running towards home, which I did faster than I had ever ran before. I didn't say anything to my parents out of fear they wouldn't believe me. My father in particular was a very down-to-earth sort of man and wouldn't believe anything that he didn't see with his own 2 eyes. We would have a few more problems after that, but they soon stopped. That was 20 years ago now and it still haunts me. Story number 2. This happened recently. My father passed away in March of this year and I decided to return home to claim the farm. It's a nice little place out north of New York. My mother passed away some years ago and I had no other siblings, so I guess the whole place was left to me. For about a week after arriving, I noticed something with the pigs my father used to raise. Some were disappearing and others were ending up dead. I didn't know why and there was nobody even remotely nearby, or so I thought. One night I was outside on the porch when I heard my dad's voice coming from the cornfield. "Come here, son," it beckoned me. I was in shock. I knew my dad was dead. I had buried him just 2 days prior. "Come on, son. I want to show you something," the voice said again. I admit, I wanted to find out who was messing with me, but something just didn't feel right. That's when I noticed the deer. For a moment, it looked just like a regular old deer. But then it spoke. "Come on, my boy," in my dad's voice. I was so utterly confused that I just froze as I stared at this deer as it stood up on its hind legs and started to walk towards me. It got about 3 meters away from me when it suddenly pounced and grabbed my neck, ripping it from me. It didn't even wait for me to die before starting to feast on me.
Story number 3. I was out camping with 2 of my buddies who I'd grown up with in a long stretch of forest north of New York. There were so many rumors of an old haunted house where people disappeared or some shit like that. We would go to the forest all the time to test our mettle, like the dumb kids we were. This one time we were camping down by the river with a fire going, trying to scare each other. We kept telling each other scary stories until well past midnight. Throughout the night, I felt like I was being watched but dismissed it as nerves. Around 1 in the morning I got up to go pee before heading to sleep. I am a very private person, so I went into the forest. Not so far that I couldn't see the light from the fire, but far enough away that I couldn't see beyond the bushes. I did my business and was about to head back but heard my friend say my name to my right. I thought he was just messing with me, so I shouted back for him to get back to the tents. But he kept beckoning me towards him and away from the camp, which I thought was odd. That's when I noticed the deer in the direction of my friend's voice. It took a moment for me to recognize what I was seeing, but when I did, my eyes widened with fear. The deer wasn't a deer. I knew because it was standing on its 2 legs. I wanted to scream but couldn't. My mouth was wide open but the scream couldn't come out. It was only when the thing, whatever it was, took a step towards me and said, "Come here, I have something to show you," in the voice of my friend. I ran back to the camp to find neither of my friends where they were supposed to be and blood everywhere. I looked around and saw my hunting rifle next to where I was sitting and went for it. That's when I noticed the thing had followed me after it stepped out of the forest and into the light. I fired 3 shots at the thing. But it didn't do anything. I knew I hit my mark. I was a pretty good shot. It stepped forward and I stepped back. I tripped on the log I was sitting on and as I did it lunged for me. Next thing I remember, I'm waking up in the hospital, with 3 gashes on my chest. Apparently, my 2 friends had found me in the woods after I had wandered off. They spent 3 days looking for me, only to find me back in the camp injured. To this day, None of us know what happened or if it even did. I just wish I could forget it, but it has haunted me ever since.
Story number 4. My dad owned a cabin out in the woods in West Virginia, and it was tradition that he would take me and my brother there hunting every spring. By all accounts, I enjoyed spending time with my dad. He was busy most of the year with business, so these hunting trips were the only real time me and my brother got to spend with him. I was 15 when this happened. We're staying at the cabin for a week. For the first 3 days we had a few decent catches, hares and the like, but we're finding it difficult to find any deer. This was odd as deer are usually everywhere. At night we were hearing strange noises, like strange animal calls at night or scratches on the door. But we just assumed there was some strange animal about. On the 4th night we didn't hear anything. I was fast asleep when my brother woke me up by screaming. We're sharing a room. I told him to shut up before realizing why he was screaming. There was a strange figure standing over his bed holding an axe. It just stood there saying, "It's okay, son. Just go back to sleep," over and over again in my dad's voice. Just then, my dad came into the room with his shotgun and shot the creature or whatever it was. It didn't seem to like that and screamed at him with the same scream that woke me up before jumping out of the window. My dad didn't waste time and dragged me and my brother out to the car and drove us the 218 miles back home. He later told me that the thing in our room was a skinwalker. He later sold the cabin and we haven't been back since.
Story 5. I don't have any family and am socially awkward, so every Christmas I stay at a cabin I own just outside Robert Lee, Texas. I usually spend 2 weeks there every Christmas because I can't stand all the festive bull that's everywhere. Last year was no different. It's important to note that I never had a coyote problem when staying at the cabin, though I was always faintly aware that they were around. But my Labrador usually alerts me if they come too close to the cabin. It doesn't happen often as they tend to keep clear for the most part. Anyway, I was staying at the cabin and had been there for a few days. I'd been having trouble with work and looked forward to the time away from everything. Third night at the cabin and Turing started barking to go out. Thinking he needed to go to the toilet, I proceeded to let him out. After a brief few minutes, he came back whimpering, as if something scared him. If you know my dog, then you know that he's the soft kind. He's the sort of dog to try and scrap with the coyotes, so this was unexpected and surprising. Stupidly, I stepped onto the cabin porch to see if there was anything outside. I didn't see anything at first, until I realized there were 2 glowing eyes staring right at me. I just stood there trying to focus on what it was when it stepped out of the darkness into the light. It looked like a coyote, but it had what looked like rotting skin. Then that smell hit me and I wanted to puke. My body seemed to move back automatically. I backed into the cabin and closet door and locked it. I ended up closing the blinds on all the windows and turning most of the lights off. I would occasionally glance out the window to find the coyote still there. It remained there throughout the night. The coyote disappeared during the day and I proceeded to forget about it. The day was normal, with me going into town to pick up a few supplies and otherwise relaxing with a few beers. Other than a few times when I felt I was being watched, it was just a normal day. It wasn't until night came when the big incident happened. It happened late, I'd say around 1 in the morning. I was awoken by scratching at my window. At first I was confused. There weren't any trees close enough to be scratching my bedroom window, so I immediately thought something was wrong. As I got up to investigate. I opened the curtains and proceeded to scream. On the other side wasn't one other than the coyote, but this time with a very human smile. I ran out of the room and grabbed my hunting rifle from the gun cabinet. After checking it was loaded, I looked out of the door window to find several coyotes with the same rotting skin as the one from the previous night. I heard the bedroom glass break and ran over to shoot the thing that had come in, but instead found a rock had smashed instead. That didn't make sense. Since when did coyotes start throwing rocks? That's when I heard it. The laughing. The coyotes were all laughing at me. The rest of the night went in much the same way. They would throw some rocks, I would fire a few shots and they would laugh at me. As soon as the morning came they left, almost as if they weren't here at all. I left as soon as it was clear and I haven't been back since. I sold the cabin a few months ago and have plans to spend this Christmas with the family of my girlfriend. I don't think I will ever forget that laughing. Story number 6. Before I tell my story, I need to tell you about the town I lived in at the time. This was about 20 years ago now, and at the time there was this whole thing about people disappearing. Strangest thing was, it happened during the day. That and people had started to disappear from their homes as well. I was only 16 at the time and was young, dumb, and a little unaware of what was going on. I was at home one October day waiting for my parents to get back with my sister, parent-teacher thing, when I heard the door knocking. Now, I wasn't a stupid child. He knew better than to open the door to strangers, so imagine my surprise when I saw that my mother was on the other side of the door. I was about to open the door when she spoke. The voice sounded like my mother, but also sounded wrong. I don't know how, but it felt off. That's when the smell hit me. Like rotten eggs mixed with necrotic flesh. I ended up throwing up right here. She said, "Open the door, dearie. Don't keep me waiting," in a soothing voice, or what was supposed to be soothing. She knocked on the door again and I stepped back, not entirely sure what was going on. I tried to call out to speak, but I couldn't form any word. Instead I found myself wanting to walk over and open the door. Before I could, however, a pair of headlights blinded me through the glass that separated me from the mother imitation that was looking at me. I woke up the next morning with no memory of what happened. I only know now because my parents told me everything. I apparently told them everything before blanking out. They never saw the thing standing out by the front door, just me standing and looking at it.
Story number 7. Just a short one. My grandfather was a Native American witch doctor who told me about skinwalkers. As you may expect, he almost never talked about skinwalkers, and he never actually called them by their name, but he taught me everything he knew. I'm a witch doctor now and I specialize in dealing with skinwalkers. But tonight is different. There are several of them waiting outside for me. Have been for several days. I won't be making it out alive. It will be a miracle if I do, but I'll certainly repost if that happens. I'll wait till daylight when they're at their weakest and then I'll go on the offensive. Wish me luck.
Story number 8. This happened about 5 years back, when I was out camping with my girlfriend. We're staying at this campsite that was a popular hotspot for love-struck teens, but we're lucky enough to have the campsite to ourselves for the most part. We spent the first 2 days hiking through the woods, something we enjoy doing to this day. At first, we didn't have any problems and all was well. But the second day was when all the problems started. Our plan was to hike in the morning and then return to the tents for lunch. When we did, we found that our tent had collapsed and all of our stuff had been thrown all over the place. It was a mess. Normally, I'd assume a bear or something was responsible for the mess, but there aren't any bears in the area and coyotes tend to stay away from anything to do with people. We spent a few hours cleaning the mess up, with an eerie sensation of being watched hanging over us. That feeling stayed through the day. Now, the rest of the day ended up being pretty boring, so I won't bore you with the details. But that night ended up being the worst night of my life. I woke up about 1 a.m. to find my girlfriend missing and the tent wide open. I quickly went out to see her and saw the fire burning, but my girlfriend was nowhere to be seen. That's when I started to hear her voice. It was coming from the forest and she was telling me to come help her. I hesitated. It sounded like her, but something felt off. The voice seemed to drift off and I stood there as growling replaced once familiar voice. I wanted to run away but I wanted to find out where she went. I knew what I had to do. I had to go after her. I don't remember what happened after I decided to find my girlfriend. I woke up in a mental institute with no memory of what happened, but they informed me that they found her mutilated body not far from the camp. I had been found next to her weeping and crying and muttering something. I get out tomorrow, despite pleas from her family. Can't say I blame them.
Story number 9. I have one personal experience. From 8 years ago I used to live on the Navajo reservation. The town was called Shiprock. I was living with a girl I met in boarding school for Native Americans. The night it happened we had decided to end the relationship and it was going to be my last night there before I went back to my reservation. She was Navajo from New Mexico and I'm Apache from Arizona. That night I was in the living room around 11 p.m. watching TV. There were 3 of us there, my ex, her dad and I. Her mom were at the casino that night. I was on the couch flipping through channels when it happened. I heard 2 ladies outside talking Navajo to each other, so I assumed my ex-girlfriend's mom was home. 20 minutes had passed and she hadn't come inside yet, so I went to ex's room and asked her if mom needed help. She told me her mom was still at the casino. I told her that's not right because there were a couple of ladies outside talking to each other. I got up, went up and turned on the patio light and went outside. The talking stopped and 2 coyotes ran from underneath the truck. Her dad woke up and told me it was probably skinwalkers. Story number 10. I was always a very curious child, as my parents could probably tell you. What piqued me curiosity the most as a child was the large patch of forest just beyond the boundaries of my backyard. When I was 8 years old, strange howling sounds would come from that patch of forest every night for around 3 months. My father never spoke about the sounds, instead ignoring them. My mother would only say that he wasn't allowed due to him being Native American. As you might guess, this always confuses me. As I said, the sounds lasted for around 3 months and ended shortly after a medicine man from my father's tribe paid a visit and went into the forest with him. Thinking back, I'm not sure if it was a skinwalker or a wendigo, but I am certain it was one of those two.
Story number 11. My brother was killed by a skinwalker. It happened when we were kids many years ago. We were out camping in the Appalachian Mountains with our dad when it happened. The first night nothing happened. The second night is when things started getting weird. That is, we started hearing noises coming from the forest. It kept my dad up all night. The following day, we were hiking through a cave we liked to visit and we started hearing Mom calling to us from the bush. Me and my dad were instantly suspicious. Mom hated the forest and would never come with us on our many camping trips. Strange thing is, Mom was only calling my little brother. That is what set me on edge. Why only call my brother and not me and Dad? Unfortunately, would find out. My brother was only 9 and was very excited. As soon as he heard Mom calling him, he ran into the forest before my dad or I could stop him. It was like we were frozen in place. When we were finally able to move, we ran in the direction of my brother. After about 5 minutes, we encountered the most horrifying sight of my life. First thing I saw was the misshapen deer. It was standing on its hind legs and had these long arms that came to its knees. The mouth was full of sharp teeth dripping red with blood. And at the feet of this monster was me brother, lying dead and half-eaten. My dad used his rifle to fire a few shots at this monster, scaring it off, but it was already too late. My brother had his entire stomach torn to pieces. There was nothing we could do for him. I only found out later that the monster I saw was Skinwalker and that they are supposed to be evil spirits or something like that. I don't know a lot about them and I don't want to either. I don't want to remember what happened to my brother. He no longer camp in those mountains anymore.
Story number 12. I never believed in skinwalkers until June of last year, when I had my own horrifying encounter. I was in Dallas, Texas visiting my old grandfather shortly before his passing. Now, nothing odd happened when I was at the hospital, but every time I was staying at his home, my grandfather spent his last few weeks in a hospice and my grandmother had passed away years prior, to help maintain it and the finances. For the first 2 weeks, I would wake up at about 3 in the morning to hear my grandmother's voice at the back door asking to be let in. I knew it couldn't be her since I was at the funeral. Every time I heard the voice I would look outside the back door and see a deer standing on its hind legs on the edge of the property. It never got any closer though and would flee every time it spotted me. Shortly before my grandfather passed away, he made mention of the skinwalker. He asked if she had returned or if I had let her in. I said yes and then no, to which my grandfather smiled. He said to never let it in if I wanted to live. I didn't understand then but I do now.
Story number 13. I used to hunt skinwalkers a long time ago. I'm of Navajo descent, though that doesn't really matter. I don't follow their customs so I don't know how they handle skinwalkers, if they do at all. I started in the late 1970s as a teenager. My father trained me for years before retiring. Last year he passed away. Skinwalkers are near impossible to kill and most people won't even be able to hurt them, let alone kill them. It's long and complicated and even outright dangerous if someone who doesn't know what they're doing tries to hunt a skinwalker, so you won't put anyone in danger by explaining how here. But skinwalkers are dangerous and will absolutely pretend to be people you know and trust to get away from you or find an opportunity to kill you. It is important to note though that the skinwalkers everybody sees are young skinwalkers that have just left their nest. They haven't yet perfected the mimicry that most people attribute to the skinwalker. You never know an adult skinwalker, as they can blend in perfectly. Only other skinwalkers can tell the difference, which is how I can hunt them. This year me son will take his place as a skinwalker hunter and it will be my turn to retire. It will be well earned. Story number 14. I grew up in a small town where stories of skinwalkers was common, so I never believed in them growing up. But that changed just days ago. As many of you are aware, the ongoing pandemic means that most everywhere is on lockdown. My parents own a cabin deep in Canadian forest and we decided to stock up and spend some time out there until the worst has blown over. So we've been there for 3 weeks now and strange things started happening 10 days in. Just little things at first. Things would get moved, our shed would get broken into, that sort of thing. But then it started to get worse. Every night, a strange smell would fill the air along with strange screams coming from just beyond the tree line. It's important to note that the screams didn't come from just one direction but at least 3 different directions. This Friday just ended up being a literal nightmare. Voices surrounded the cabin, some of them familiar and others not so much. There was banging on the walls and screams were coming from all directions. My dad and I would take our hunting rifles and guard the windows. I would occasionally catch a glimpse of some hideous creature that would briefly leave the forest line before jumping back out of view. It's been days now and we're running out of supplies. We thought we were safe during the day. But Dad went hunting today and hasn't returned. The car won't turn on and the generator is running out of fuel. I don't know how much longer we can last. But if Dad doesn't return, then we have to make a run for it soon. I'm scared.
Story number 15. So, people have been disappearing recently. They'll go missing for weeks before reappearing out of nowhere. The problem is that when they eventually return, they can't speak, don't recognize anyone or anything, and act strangely, almost as if they're trying to imitate themselves. Everyone can tell that something is wrong. A family that went missing late last year reappeared, even though we found their bodies in the cabin they owned. I helped search for them. You should have seen the little girl, it was horrible. Skinwalkers used to be common here, but after the mayor got a bunch of shamans a few years ago, they all but disappeared. I think they've returned, but nobody wants to believe me. It may already be too late.
Story number 16. This happened a long time ago, so my memories aren't exactly clear, especially considering the events that took place. I was up in the Lake District in Canada camping and hiking with my brother and his girlfriend when it all happened. It was a trip they bought me on after my boyfriend of 8 years passed away in a car crash and they thought it might help me move on. Anyway, on the 4th day of our camping trip we set up camp at a large stream. It was a pretty good area to set up camp. Nothing strange happened at all during the day, so we never had a reason to suspect anything would happen. It was quiet all day, but then the night came and strange things started to happen. We were around the campfire having a few drinks when the sound started to come out of the forest. They sounded like someone was screeching, but it also sounded unnatural, twisted even. My brother just laughed it off, claiming it was just the drinks making us think sounds were something else, something which both me and his girlfriend were very quick to agree with. A few hours later we had retreated to the comfort of our tent. The others were sleeping, but I couldn't get those sounds out of my mind. Around 2 a.m. in the morning he started to hear whispering come from outside the tent. I just thought being tired and drunk was playing tricks on my mind. But the whispering just grew louder and louder, until I could swear that I recognized the voice. It sounded like my dead girlfriend, which was impossible. The voice kept insisting I come outside, and in my then current state I must have decided to leave the safety off the tent. I say must have because I don't actually remember leaving the tent. I don't remember anything about the night, but my brother and his girlfriend found me the following morning unconscious. I still don't know what happened, but whenever I bring it up people ask if Skinwalker may be involved. Most of the time they're joking, but it does make me wonder if that was what really happened.
Story number 17. I don't know if skinwalkers exist, but I may have a story to share. I live in a small town in Colorado and there is this really famous abandoned house on the edge of town. It's famous because not even the druggies that like to shoot up in the various abandoned properties around town go to that particular house. Last November, a pair of young kids went into that house and one of them ended up getting brutally murdered and eaten. The other kid managed to get away and get the police involved. The kid was supposedly murdered by his own mother, despite her working in a hospital the other side of town when he was killed. The kid that survived was absolutely certain that it was the kid's mother that was the killer. Is this Skinwalker? I really don't know. Story number 18. I was a police sergeant at some rural backwater back in 1973 when I had my first encounter. The station itself was small, as in under 10 people small, so everybody took it in turns to patrol the roads. It didn't matter as the town itself only had maybe 100 or so people, so there was rarely any trouble. Well, normally there wasn't any trouble. 1973 was the year everything went to hell. It started in February of that year when one of the local kids went missing while messing about in a small patch of forest known for its popularity with drug users. Now, it was rare for kids to go missing in with the problems we'd been having with some users who had moved just outside of town, so everybody scrambled to find the missing boy. We never found the boy. We heard him a bunch of times while searching for him, and I swear I saw glimpses of him around town for weeks following the search. If only it had been him. Then in March, an abandoned camp was found not far from the place where the kid disappeared. It wasn't uncommon for the users to set up a camp somewhere where they wouldn't be bothered, and that was clearly what had happened here. Everyone at the station and in town naturally assumed the people who set up the campsite was somehow involved with the missing kid and had made a break for it. Funny thing was that they left a significant stash of shims behind, something users would never do. But it was the best lead we had at the time. It wasn't until late May that we found the bodies of the two people not far from the campsite. There wasn't any flesh left, but it was obvious that they'd been torn apart. Bones were scattered everywhere and looked as though they'd been partially eaten. It was an obvious animal attack, and although there were both bears and wolves in the area, they tended to avoid people. McKinkey's very strange. More people started disappearing following the discovery of the bodies. Problem was, they'd often be seen after they disappeared, but they'd never interact with anyone. We never found most of them, and the few we did find had already been torn apart and eaten. We placed bounties, hired hunters, even got the National Guard in to try and look for whatever was responsible, but the attacks continued. The town is all but abandoned now. Most people fled after the National Guard failed to stop the killings. The few that remained have all gone missing. I don't know if skinwalkers were involved, but I've been told that it's a very real possibility. I wish I knew.
Story number 19. I was out camping with some friends when it all happened. We were up north from New York near a place known for some famous disappearances a decade ago, which was awesome because we were all super into that stuff. Anyway, it was our third night camping out when one of our friends just went missing. Now it's important to note that Jane wasn't one to just get up and walk off. For starters, she was terrified of the dark, so she naturally stayed close to the campfire. Secondly, nobody noticed her leave. There were 6 of us, myself included, and we all decided to stay in pairs in case we got separated for whatever reason. Jane was supposed to stick with me since we were kind of into each other, but I didn't see her leave at all. We searched for her and kept hearing her call our names, but every time we got close to where we heard her, she'd call to us from deeper into the forest. What was strange was that one of us would hear her but the rest couldn't. Like she would speak to me trying to get me to move one direction, but then she'd tell one of the others to walk the complete opposite direction. It was confusing and terrifying, as we didn't know what was going on. Then we saw her. Jane was standing in front of us, her skin a pale gray and her eyes a jet black. It wasn't Jane, but it looked like her. Whatever it was, it charged at us as soon as it spotted us, causing us all to flee. Me and 3 of the others managed to get away, but one of our friends, Billy, wasn't so lucky. The Rangers found 3 bodies a week later, all torn up. It was officially ruled as a bear, and some people blame us, but I know it was a skinwalker.
Story number 20. I used to live in the Rocky Mountains as a kid with my dad. He was a bushcraft teacher who helped train people to survive in the Rocky Mountains and would often take me on camping trips. When I was 8, my dad took me on one particular camping trip that I remember strongly to this day. Now it's important to note that we used to hunt for food on the many camping trips we took together. This time was no different, and the first thing me and my dad did was begin tracking a deer. We managed to catch up with a small group of maybe 5 or 6 deer at a clearing when I heard my dad say, "Watch the deer." But he didn't say that. Instead, my dad raised his rifle not at the group of deer but at another deer that had just entered the clearing. But it wasn't a deer. It was walking on 2 legs and it looked like my dad's face but twisted and misshapen. I tried to scream but no sound came out. My dad fired 3 shots at the thing before dragging me away from it. We ran harder and faster than I ever remember running straight to the truck my dad drove us here in. We didn't even return to the camp we'd set up. Later my dad did end up returning to the campsite to find someone or something had been rummaging through it. He hasn't spoken about it since, and neither of us has been to that part of the mountains since.
Story number 21. This happened not long ago, so it's still pretty fresh in my mind. Due to the pandemic, I decided to hunt for my meat rather than go to somewhere like Walmart for obvious reasons. If nothing else, I at least know where my meat came from. Anyway, a few weeks ago I was tracking some deer along a large stream when I began smelling a foul odor in the air. At first I ignored it and moved on. It wasn't exactly rare to accidentally come across a dead animal. But it started to become an issue after I began tracking a small group of 4 deer. Now, I've been around coyotes, wolves and bears. They don't always smell the best and sometimes they smell real bad. I started to panic because I was concerned I was being stalked by a predator, which almost never ends well, and I was considering turning back and getting out of there when I came face to face with it. I don't know what it was, but it was tall and was a sickly gray. It looked like a deer, but it was standing on its hind legs and its head was as human as it was deer. It had blood dripping from its mouth and it looked as though it was trying to talk to, or at, me, but no sound ever came out. The most disturbing thing, however, was that it was carrying a dead coyote in his arms. I just stood there terrified as it finally spoke to me. "You shouldn't be here," it said to me, before running off into the forest. It's been 3 weeks and I haven't been back there since. Story number 22. I saw a skinwalker once. It was a long time ago now, though I remember it as clearly as if it had just happened. I was a pizza boy back when I was still in college, so I could earn some money when I had to take a delivery out to an old farmhouse. The farmhouse was well known as he ordered pizza almost every night. 2 large pepperoni pizzas and a bottle of Coke was their usual order. I remember because I was one of only 2 delivery drivers who were willing to go out that far. My last night as a delivery driver, we got the normal call from them, so I grabbed their order and drove out to the farmhouse. Normally, I'd walk up to the front door and give them their order. But this time I pulled up to see the husband standing out front, waiting for me. This wasn't normal, especially since it was raining heavily that night. I pulled up and rolled down my window. Before I could speak up, however, he grabbed me and attempted to pull me out of the car. It's at that point I noticed the mouth, the teeth and the eyes. I only got a brief glimpse, but it was enough to scar me for life. I managed to break free from him and pull away, but he managed to run alongside my car as I started going faster. Eventually he stopped trying to chase me as I sped up past the speed limit. Later it turned out the couple at the farmhouse were brutally murdered 2 days before I made the delivery. I later asked my granddad, who's familiar with the Navajo, and he told me it was most likely a skinwalker before laughing. Thinking back, his laugh was a more nervous laugh than one intended as a joke. I don't know if that was skinwalker, but I'm lucky to be alive.
Story number 23. I work as a farmhand not far from a nearby Native American reserve. It's hard work, but honest, and I wouldn't have it any other way. The only problem I have is the occasional weird thing that usually ends with a blessing from the medicine men from the nearby reserve. The last time this happened was just a few months ago. Despite the whole pandemic going on, the farms still need to work due to the need for food. Anyway, the farm where I work is surrounded by a bunch of other farms, some independent, some owned by the big agriculture companies and some owned by the reserve. That means a lot of people work in the area despite it being mostly farmland, but it also meant that there was a few months earlier this year where people would disappear. No one knew what happened to those who disappeared or even how it happened, but it didn't take long for rumors to begin spreading around. I had some of my friends and fellow farm hands come up to me and say they saw some disfigured coyote run through the cornfields in the days leading up to a disappearance, or some of the cattle herders finding mutilated cows in a tree. I never saw anything personally, but the disappearances ended after a group of medicine men from the reserve came and blessed all the farms. Now, I've only just found out about skinwalkers, and while this does seem to fit in with what happened, I can't really be sure. Maybe it was a skinwalker, maybe it was something else.
Story number 24. I once came face to face with a skinwalker and survived. This happened several years ago, but it's burned into my mind like nothing else. I work at a lumber company where my job is to scout out parts of forests suitable for harvesting. It's hard work as I need to fill a quota given to me by the company and keep to standards set by the EPA, and it often means I spend days out in the wilderness looking for good lumber spots. Well, it was one of these extended camping trips where I had my encounter. I was 4 days in and I had already found several good spots for the company, but wanted to get a few more in before I left. I spent the first half of the day surveying the area, being careful to note my path so I didn't get lost. When it happened, babe, I heard it as clear as day. It was my wife. I mean, it had to be her voice. Babe, I need your help, she said again. I didn't understand what was going on. She kept calling out to me, calling out for help, but it was coming from all around me and it sounded like she was getting closer. I stood there paralyzed, unable to think and unable to really do anything. I quickly spotted something moving in the bushes in front of me. It was a deer, but it was different somehow. I couldn't focus at first, but then I realized what I was looking at. It wasn't a deer. I mean, it looked like a deer, but it was standing on its back legs, had no fur and was a sickly gray color. "Babe, why won't you help me?" it said. It was speaking to me, but it sounded like my wife. It stepped out of the bushes, into the clearing in front of me, and I ran. I didn't even think, I just ran. I kept running, even as it stopped chasing me. I had never ran so fast before. It was morning when I finally reached my truck. Tired and afraid, I managed to return to the lumber office. I couldn't tell them what I saw, none of them would believe me. I simply gave them my list of sites for harvesting. I wish I hadn't, since several of the lumberjacks have disappeared since the company started harvesting trees in the area.
Story number 25. For the last few weeks, my dogs have been barking at something that only comes out at night. I know what it is, but I don't want to say its name. I don't want to give it power over him. I don't want to bring it on. It started just after Halloween. At first I thought it was just a bunch of kids pranking me, or maybe someone was making a cruel joke at my expense. As a Native American, a lot of people have a warped view on my beliefs. When I moved into my current home a year ago, a lot of people were distrustful of me. I don't know why, though I later found out the area is deeply conservative and most likely that's why. Anyway, after the first week off my dogs barking at someone, I began noticing an odd smell whenever my dogs started barking. I can't really describe it other than the foulness of the smell. It was like a rotting corpse. 2 weeks ago, things got worse. I caught it trying to open the back door to my house and I immediately began praying, causing it to flee. That's when I realized what had been stalking my home and me. A medicine man from my tribe is already on his way, but I'm scared. I don't know what will happen. Story number 26. My brother was killed by a skinwalker. It happened when I was younger, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We were out hunting in West Virginia when it all happened. It was early in the morning and we were following a deer trail when my brother told me that he thought someone was following us. I turned but didn't see anyone, but he said they were in the bush. My mistake was laughing it off. He was following me. Not 10 minutes after he mentioned us being followed, we came across our first deer. It hadn't spotted us and we were downwind, so I thought it was a good idea to get some target practice in. I almost took the shot when I realized my brother had said anything about the deer. Normally, I wouldn't be able to get him to shut up. So this was weird. I turned and couldn't see him. I started to panic. Forgetting about the deer, I turned and ran down the trail. What I found was horrifying. My brother was on the ground, covered in blood. Standing over him was this thing. It looked like a deer standing on its hind legs. Its fur was matted and the skin was rotting. The worst was that its jaws were dripping with blood. I stood there frozen as the thing, the skinwalker, noticed me. It didn't try to come after me, instead it simply smiled and dragged my brother into the bush. We never found his body, but ended up getting arrested for his murder. I'm sharing this story from a prison cell, hoping somebody believes me. If you do, don't go into the Appalachian Mountains.
Story number 27. This is a more personal story from me, the writer of the blog. It actually just happened an hour ago, as of writing, when I was walking my dog. Near to where I live is an old, abandoned railway that people use as a dog trail. It's fairly woody and passes by a meadow with 2 small ponds. Because of the heavy rains we've had over the last few weeks and it being winter, seagulls from the coast have decided to holiday in my small landlocked town. This is normal and happens every year, so nobody really cares. I don't really care myself, as why would I need to, and I normally ignore them. Until this morning when one started meowing right in my face. Like a cat would. Now, while many of the stories I share with you all come from the US where skinwalkers are known to exist, I live in the UK where we never get this sort of thing. We don't even get lycanthropes, real or mental illness, anymore. Not that it would mean anything. Now, I'm fairly knowledgeable on skinwalkers, but I've never heard of one that's made the cross between the continents before. Do any of you have the answers I need? Could they even take the form of a small bird? I'm weirded out by the whole thing.
Story number 28. A friend of mine had an encounter with a skinwalker. She was 8 when it happened, but she still remembers it now as if it happened yesterday. She won't tell me the whole story, but judging by how scared she gets when she tells me what she can, I have no reason to not believe her. The way she tells it, One night she was about to go to bed when her father told my friend and her mother to hide in the basement. My friend was confused, but apparently her mother knew what was going on. Now, the basement of the house had a window, but it had been broken for some time, and so my friend could hear everything going on outside. She would periodically hear her father yell "Skinwalker," or "there it is," before eventually falling asleep. She told me this happened several nights in a row before it stopped. To this day she rarely talks about it, and her father refuses to when asked.
Story number 29. My mother was a skinwalker. She killed my father and sister when I was 12 and very nearly killed me as well. It was all part of some ritual she wanted to perform to turn her into a skinwalker. I'm not sure what exactly happened due to my injuries and the shock of the events, but what I do know is that someone called the police and they managed to stop her from finishing me off. This isn't something I normally talk about, but recently something happened that has me concerned for my safety. After the police arrested my mother, she was sent to an asylum where she stayed for the last 10 years. She escaped a week ago, after killing 2 nurses and a guard. I'm scared she'll come after me, and so I've been moving from place to place. I'm scared and I don't know what to do.
Story number 30. The real legends of skinwalkers as told by the Navajo speak of life and death situations between the Navajo and skinwalkers. A friend of mine recounted a family legend that was passed down to him and his 2 brothers. Long before Europeans settled the land, the Navajo often battled skinwalkers to protect the tribe. One of the ancestors of my friend was said to have battled the most powerful skinwalker ever to exist. The battle raged for days before both eventually died from their wounds. I'm not sure if skinwalkers exist, but the legend is kind of awesome.
Story number 31. I saw a skinwalker recently. It was about a month ago when I was helping out my father-in-law in his old scrapyard working on an old Ford Mustang. He had the car for the longest time, but it was a complete wreck. It would cost more for a shop to work on it than it was worth, so he decided he would keep it around in case he ever found the opportunity to start working on it himself. Anyway, due to business being slow in December, he decided to take some time off and start working on the car and asked me to help, knowing that I'm a mechanic at one of the shops in town. We'd spent the day digging through the various scrap piles looking for parts that would work in the Mustang, and by the time it got dark we'd assembled a fair few bits and pieces, including some original parts for the engine. By the time we had finished moving all the pieces into an empty tool shed, it was getting pretty late. So I decided I would go get my car to take him back home and then head back myself while he locked up. I turned a corner and saw my father-in-law standing by my car. This was impossible. I looked at where I had come from and he was still at the tool shed admiring all the parts we had gathered. But then I could see him clear as day in front of me, lit up by a street lamp. Stupidly, I started walking closer and closer to the man who stood by my car and was horrified by what I saw. It was my father-in-law, but a crude copy of him. He was just standing there with this horrifying open grin, his mouth full of teeth like dog teeth or wolf teeth. His eyes were pitch black and his skin was a light, mottled gray. He looked right at me, didn't say a word, then started walking towards me. Without hesitation I turned and ran back towards the tool shed, but it was too late. Whatever that thing managed to grab me and I screamed. I tried to fight it off, punched it, kicked it, everything I called do. What I didn't see was my father-in-law coming up to us with his 12 gauge he carried around, though I did hear him take a shot. The thing that was on top of me looked at him and decided 2 was too many before running off on all 4s. Neither of us want to talk about it, but he can't stop thinking about what happened. Fortunately I wasn't cut up too bad and was able to explain it all away by saying I was in a bit of an accident when searching for scrap. But it bothers me, and I know it still bothers my father-in-law.
Story 32. This is an update to the mother story. The guy who told me his story gave me an update a few days ago. There was a small manhunt for his mother who had escaped a mental institution. Well, they found her. They think. Turns out, she escaped into a well-known national park and began preying on the local wildlife. Reports of some wild beast a woman started making the rounds, and the park services launched an investigation, thinking someone was living where they shouldn't be. What they found was a woman who looked a lot like the mother, but with honors growing out of her head and her skin a mottled gray. She was discovered by a pair of rangers who were forced to shoot her after she tried attacking them. Weirdly, she reverted back to her normal human form as she died. The guy shared this with me, but has asked not to be identified. The Park Service has made no comment.
Story number 33. I was once surrounded by a family of skinwalkers. This happened earlier this year when I was driving back home from a 3-day work trip and was driving through North Carolina when my truck ran out of fuel. It was a stupid ass mistake that I should have kept an eye on. To make things worse, the car stopped in an area covered in forest miles away from the nearest gas station. After making a few calls, all I could do was wait. It was already dark when I thought I spotted someone a good distance in front of me. It looked like a person standing in the middle of the road. I couldn't see if they were looking at me or not. But they were just standing here not moving. I decided to stay in my truck as I wasn't sure about what to do. This turned out to be a good idea as I very quickly spotted something moving in the forest to the right of my truck. Again, I couldn't clearly see what it was, but it did look as if there was a person trying to keep low to the ground. And again on my left. Before I could see what either of the things or people or whatever they were, a large coyote jumped onto the front of my car. It started howling and growling at me, trying to break through the front window. Then something hit the driver's side window. I turned to look, and saw what could only be described as a monster. It was a person, but they had the legs and arms of a coyote and their face was all messed up, like if a child tried to make a human face out of clay. Whatever it was smiled, showing me the sharp teeth that fill at its mouth. I didn't dare look at the passenger side window as I heard something hit it. The monster was about to open my door when a light came from behind. The rescue truck had arrived to pick me up. The light must have scared the things surrounding me because they all ran off back into the forest. I looked in front of me and whoever was standing out in the middle of their road had gone. The driver who'd come to get me had told me that this occasionally happens and it's probably best not to talk about it to anyone. He told me that none of the locals use that road after dark. Now I know why.
Story number 34. For the last 10 years me and my wife have owned and worked on a cattle farm. It's a decent sized herd we use for the meat, and though it's been tough the last few years, we're making enough to get by comfortably. A few months ago we welcomed our baby girl, hopefully the first of many kids and grandkids, so my wife was stuck raising her while I managed the farm alone. He didn't mind since cattle are normally pretty easy to handle. This particular day was different. Herd was skittish and on alert the entire day, which cattle don't normally do unless they smell something they don't like. I assumed there were coyotes somewhere nearby, but for some reason I couldn't hear them. Coyotes are usually pretty loud, so this was really unnerving. I'd make regular patrols around my land to make sure nothing was where it shouldn't be, usually finding nothing. It was getting pretty late by the time I decided to take one last patrol around the farm. It was already pretty dark, so I wasn't expecting to see much. I was at the opposite side of the farm away from the house when I thought I heard a voice come from in front of me. I was a little confused. We live in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town and 2 miles from the nearest homestead. It couldn't have been my wife since she was back in the house, leaving me wondering who it was in front of me. I started approaching carefully, only to begin recognizing voice. It was my wife. I began wondering why she was all the way out here rather than with our daughter, until I got closer to the figure standing in front of me. Whoever, or whatever they were, it wasn't my wife. Their back was turned, but I could clearly see they were wearing some sort of fur coat. I stopped before I could get too close and stuttered hello. The figure didn't answer me, didn't even seem to hear me. Hello, I asked again, louder this time. I wish I had apostrophe T. The figure turned and I clearly saw what it looked like. It looked like a horrifying, misshapen version of my wife, as if she'd been crudely made out of clay. Whatever it was, it didn't speak. Instead it smiled and started walking towards me. But not like a normal person would, like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. It walked slowly as I stood there frozen in fear. One step, then another, then another. I tried to scream, to move. Then it looked me in the eyes and said, "Baby, why don't you come over here and help me?" It sounded exactly like my wife, but I suddenly found myself able to move. It wanted me to approach it, but I ran. It took me minutes to make it back to the house, but just as I was about to enter I heard a coyote call out in the distance. I hadn't heard coyotes all day and now I was hearing them. I had to make the choice to either protect my herd or my family, and I chose the latter. I love my cows, I do. But my family comes first. I found my wife in the living room, already having put our daughter to bed. I quickly forced her upstairs and barricaded all 3 of us in the bedroom. I didn't have time to explain when we heard knocking at the front door, and then we heard the same voice call out to me, "Baby, I'm cold. Please let me in." It still sounded exactly like my wife, who was now standing right next to me. She asked me what was happening, but I had no answers for her. The thing, whatever it was, kept banging on the doors and windows, occasionally trying to convince me to let it in. Sometimes it would be replaced by coyote calls, but usually the only thing we could hear was that thing using the voice of my wife. The very next morning it had gone, and 3 of my cows had been killed.
Story number 35. I never believed in skinwalkers before the night. That horrible night. West Virginia has been home to my family for generations, ever since the first settlers came here in the 1700s. In fact, I'm the first of my family to live outside of Virginia since coming here, and my son is the first born outside the state. In all that time, stories of skinwalkers were of course passed down from the natives and through my family. My great-great-grandmother was a native, but I never believed them. I've spent the last 3 months staying at a cabin my dad used to own out in the woods. Solar panels et al. Quiet, peaceful, and far away from all the bullshit going on in the world. My wife doesn't really enjoy it all that much since she's got a bit too much of the city in her. And our son, at 6 months, is too young to care. The cabin is rather nice, as far as most cabins go. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and even a small bath-shower combo. The front of the cabin had a small porch with a bench and light. Simple. Other than the driveway and road leading up to the cabin, there is a 4-meter clearing surrounding it, which itself is surrounded by thick forest. The only other buildings are the tool shed and the waste tank. The nearest town was maybe 40 miles away. Not really that isolated, but isolated enough that it didn't really matter. The night in question happened just last week. We just come back after spending the day visiting my mother and were more than ready to just call it a day. Jack, my son, was already asleep, which made it easier for us to settle down, and my wife was practically falling asleep herself. For context, we didn't get back to the cabin until well past 10:30, and we'd been up since 5 that morning. So while she put Jack to bed, I went out onto the porch for a quick smoke. The wife doesn't really like me smoking, so I usually take a quick one last thing on the porch where she doesn't have to smell the smoke. Normally I just sit there for a good 20-30 minutes, not really caring all that much about what's going on. Sometimes I'll try to see if I can hear coyotes or wolves, though this night it was oddly quiet. Admittedly, I wasn't really trying, but coyotes especially were common enough that it was rare not to hear a pack of them this far out into the forest. I quickly finished and was about to go inside when I heard a coyote call coming from the forest. The weird thing is, it sounded like the coyote was right in front of the cabin. Then I realized that it didn't really sound like a coyote at all. It sounded like someone making a coyote call. And it was coming from just within the forest, where I couldn't see anything. No one was supposed to be out here but me and my family, but there was someone in the forest right now making coyote noises. What if they were some crazy person watching me and my family? I rushed inside to find my wife in a state of panic and holding Jack. "What's going on?" I asked her. The shocked and scared look on her face said it all. "In there," she said, pointing towards the main bedroom. I rushed in but didn't see anything. Then I saw the window. It was open, and there was blood all over it. I rushed back to my wife, and what she told me horrified me. Some sort of weird monster opened the window from the outside and started climbing in. She couldn't get a good look at it before grabbing Jack and getting out of there, but she described it as looking like a dog but bigger and a little like a person. It sounded like she was describing a werewolf. Either way, we couldn't stay there. We spent the next few days staying with my mother before I returned to the cabin. I went back with my brother and 2 of my uncles. They spent the journey there mocking me on running, knowing full well I kept a gun in the cabin at all times. It stopped when we got there. The cabin was destroyed. It had caught fire and had burned down. Surrounding what had been my cabin were coyote tracks. I don't know if it really was a skinwalker, but from what me and my wife witnessed, I have no reason to doubt it.
Story number 36. This happened a few years ago, back when I was still in high school. I had this friend. He was a bit weird, a bit strange. Always talked about odd things like Bigfoot and wendigos. Most everyone else would avoid him, but he would often tell these spooky stories of people who went into the forest and saw things. Sometimes these people would go back into the forest and never come back out again. These stories always caught my interest as I got really deep into horror at the time, so we both hung out a lot outside of school. We both lived on the same street as well, not far from each other, so we'd hang around during the holidays as well. So it was no surprise that we spent all of Easter break together. The first few days we stayed in town, mostly staying in and around the local arcade since there wasn't much else to do. Small town and all that. But there was a small forest just south of the town no one really went to other than campers and hikers. It wasn't spooky or known for having a bad rep or anything, just most people didn't really care to go there. So after a few days me and my friend were bored and didn't want to spend all day at the arcade again, so he suggested we go to the forest. You know, explore it while telling horror stories to each other. It seemed like a fun idea at the time, and I suppose it would be. After hopping on a bus that had a stop not far from there, we arrived at the forest not truly expecting anything to happen. We'd scare each other using our stories before heading back into town before it got dark. And that's what happened for the first few hours. Like I said, we weren't expecting anything to happen, but we weren't expecting to find anything either. So imagine our surprise when we stumbled across this old beaten-up house far from the nearest road. Windows all smashed in, no door, and with stuff growing all over it. It was so out of place that at first we couldn't believe what we were seeing. Why was there a house all the way out here? It didn't make sense. Without thinking, my friend turned to me and told me he was going inside before walking towards the building. I didn't say anything, instead just followed him, and that was a mistake. There wasn't much inside, just dusty furniture, loads of cobwebs, and the sort of stuff you'd expect to see in an abandoned house. Wasn't as scary as I thought it'd be. We're about to turn around and leave when we heard it. A howl from outside. I had never heard a sound like that in my life before or since. We were upstairs when we heard it, and a god thing too, because it sounded like it was coming from the door we used to get inside. Another howl confirmed the fact that it wasn't just in our heads. My friend turned to me and said it was a coyote. I'd never seen a coyote before and was told that they weren't all that common in the area the town was due to overhunting. I called bullshit right before whatever it was howled for a third time. Then we heard it speak. "Come down here," a voice called out. It wasn't a normal voice. It sounded like a smoker's voice, but with this odd high-pitch, low-pitch mix that made it sound unnatural, like something pretending to speak with a human voice. "I know you're here," it said. "Why don't you come down here?" We both just stood there, frozen in place. It spoke again, but I couldn't understand what it was saying. Then we heard a gunshot and someone shout, "Get away from there." There was some sort of struggle before an elderly Native American came and found us. He never told us what was waiting for us downstairs, just told us it was evil and to never come back to the house. I still get nightmares of that day.
Story number 37. I've known about skinwalkers my entire life. I'm not a Native American or anything, just grew up close to a reservation. But I didn't encounter one until several weeks after I turned 24. Me and my dad would often go out hunting deer. He never brought meat, always preferring to source his own meat rather than risk buying it from a store or farm. He also hates factory farms, due to their treatment of farm animals. So when he called me up to ask me if I wanted to go hunting with him, I thought nothing of it and agreed to go with him. We agreed to spend a day hunting in this area my dad loved to go hunting in since it would see a lot of deer. The morning we spent hunting was unusually quiet. That area of forest usually had plenty of animals, not just deer, passing through as a lot of different natural trails met up and intersected there. It wasn't just the wildlife. My dad was unusually quiet too. Even when we were driving Tothat out of the forest, there was a road with a parking spot for hunters about 3 miles south off where we were. Normally, he wouldn't shut up about the small farm he had. He grew carrots, potatoes and a few other crops, or about the various tractors he would fix up for many of the local farmers. But he was quiet all day. The entire thing felt off to me and I didn't like it. I straight up asked him if he was okay and he took a while to answer. He simply told me he was okay, just preoccupied with something. It wasn't like him at all. I was about to ask him when we heard a coyote pack go insane off in the distance. That isn't odd in itself, and the area has several prominent wolf and coyote packs whose territories all meet up here, but it certainly didn't help the uneasy feeling that was evident. I turned back to my dad and he was as pale as porcelain. He just sat there, frozen in fear upon hearing the coyotes off in the distance. That wasn't like him at all. We heard coyotes all the time. He kept looking all over the place, as if he were expecting something he didn't want to see walk into view. That's when he focused on a spot right in front of us. At first I didn't know what he was looking at. I tried to find whatever it was but gave up. It was only when I was about to turn to him and ask when I spotted it. There was a figure hiding in the forest, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any real details. It looked like a person. It wasn't uncommon to see other hunters out in the forest. But whoever this figure was didn't seem like a hunter. I turned to my dad and asked who that person was. He simply continued to sit there silently, staring at the person in front of us. It felt like a lifetime before we heard the coyotes again, this time a lot closer to where we were. Whoever was watching us heard the coyotes as well, but apparently took more exception to hearing them. Without any warning, it let out this loud, guttural call no human could possibly make. What it did next haunts me to this day. Without missing a beat, it got on its hands and feet and began moving away from us and towards the direction of the coyotes. It looked so unnatural, like it really was just a person trying to run on all fours. The last thing I saw was whatever it was begin running like a coyote at full speed. It wasn't even 5 minutes later when me and my dad could hear the coyotes go insane as he tried to fight something off. Neither of us said anything as we practically ran back to the car we used to get there. My dad never went hunting in that forest after that. He passed away last year, never once talking about what we had seen that day.
Story number 38. I was on holiday when I saw my first skinwalker. It was in 1991 and my parents took to a campground in Texas that wasn't far from an area with a known coyote problem. Wary only staying there for a week, but being the young kid I was, I got bored very quickly. It only took 3 days before I ended up wandering away from my parents and off the campsite itself. Mind you, this was before everyone had cell phones and cameras and all that in their pocket, so if someone went missing, they really went missing. I wasn't sure how long or how far he walked, but I remember ending up near a small patch of trees. By now I was getting hungry, so I called for my mother. I assumed, being the dumbass kid that I was, that she wasn't all that far from where I was. I turned around but couldn't see either of my parents anywhere. Hell, I couldn't see much of anything, save for an old dirt road and trees. I started to get scared as I realized that there wasn't anyone around, let alone my parents. I panicked and started running the way I thought I came but ended up tripping and falling over. I'm not ashamed to admit that I started to cry. I was only 6 at the time. But then I started to hear my mother call for me. I started looking around, but couldn't see her. She called my name again and I started getting confused. I couldn't see her anywhere yet it sounded like she was right next to me. I kept looking around, getting more and more upset when I heard it. A gunshot followed by what sounded like a dog screaming. Then I heard my mother again, this time calling for help. She was begging and pleading for me to come and help her. Then another gunshot and I thought I could hear her howl in pain. Then a coyote came running from the small patch of trees, followed very quickly by a tall man. He raised a rifle and shot the coyote, killing it. He made sure it was dead before turning to me and asking if I was alright. Long story short, I fully believe that coyote was really a skinwalker trying to lure me into the trees and that the man saved my life. He turned out to be a family friend of my uncle who lived near there and managed to get me back to my parents safely. It's been 30 years since that day and I've devoted my life to hunting down skinwalkers. They're rare enough that I've only ever encountered 17 throughout my life, 12 of which I killed personally. But there are still more out there, waiting, watching. I'm always ready for my next encounter.
Story number 39. I was out hiking when I saw it. There's this little country road just outside of town where I live that leads to the next town over, but I wasn't going all the way. Instead, I was heading off to a friend's house. He lives on a farm that grows corn, and it would only take me about an hour to get there if I walked. So I walked. I have to admit that I decided to walk to my friend's house late at night, around 9:30, and it was late September, so it was already dark outside. I didn't really care and decided to do it anyway. I was maybe 20 minutes away from my friend's house when I started hearing sounds coming from behind me. It wasn't the sound of an approaching car or truck, but it sounded like something was following me. At first I thought it might just be some stray dog and ignored it. We don't really have any wolves or coyotes in this area, so I wasn't concerned about wild animals attacking me. We don't have bears around here. I kept walking and whatever was behind me kept following. That's when I heard a scream, or howl. I'm not sure, coming from behind. I stopped dead in my tracks and turned around. I saw it. I couldn't make out any real details, but it was over 6 feet tall. The arms were long and lanky and ended with what appeared as dark claws. The head, if it were a head, had 2 pairs of massive antlers that I could just about make out in the moonlight. It was skinny, almost unnaturally so. Whatever it was growling at me. I stood there, terrified at what I was seeing. Then it started moving towards me. 1 step, then another. On the 3rd step I snapped out of it and ran towards my friend's house. I could hear it trying to catch up with me, but it also sounded like it was struggling to run on 2 legs. I managed to reach the lit road that led up to my friend's house through his family farm and kept running up it. I kept banging on his door until he let me in before I realized that it wasn't actually chasing me anymore. He let me in and asked me about what was going on. But before I could tell him, we both heard the same scream from before. It was coming from outside, just far enough away that it would have come from the start off to road that I had just ran down. I'm not sure if that was a skinwalker, or just a figment of my imagination or something else entirely, and honestly I don't care. I never want to see that thing ever again.
Story number 40. I know skinwalkers are real. I've seen my fair share of them. But in reality I've only ever seen the one. When I was a boy, my grandfather told me stories of skinwalkers, of witch doctors who would sacrifice members of their own family in order to gain power by appeasing the spirits. I'm unsure as to whether or not it's true. I suppose it doesn't matter anymore. I saw the skinwalker for the first time at age 10. My father took me hunting one day, since he always preferred to source his own meat and wanted to encourage me to do the same. Most of the day went about as normally as you'd expect. He was teaching me how to track deer when we started to smell something horrible. It was like something died and was rotting, but right next to us. My father told me it was probably just some animal that had unfortunately died and decided we should move on. The strangest thing is that the smell seemed to be following us. We walked for about 3 miles, and even though we should have been far away from the source of the smell, it was still strong. We ended up stopping near a small stream so my father could refill our water bottles. He also liked drinking stream water, saying it was often better than factory-bottled spring water. Just as he was about to fill the first water bottle, he stopped and looked behind us. He quickly grabbed his hunting rifle and quickly raised it. I turned around and saw what he saw right as he fired 3 rounds. I only saw a glimpse of it, whatever it was, before my father grabbed me and ran downstream. I was screaming as he dragged me along since I didn't know what was going on. We eventually made out of there without encountering it ever again. A few years later, and another 2 times seeing it again in that same forest, my grandfather sat me down and told me that what I'd seen was in fact a skinwalker. I've only seen it 5 more times since he told me that before I moved away from the area. I'm more curious than scared, and I'm planning on a trip back home so I can try and gather evidence that it exists and isn't just in my head.
Story number 41. This just happened last night and I'm still unsure if what I saw was real or not. I work as a truck driver, and for the last few weeks I've been hauling log piles back and forth between various sites down in Louisiana. It's long hours, stressful to all hell, and pays pretty good. Last night I was on my way to a logging camp out in the middle of nowhere when my truck suddenly broke down. It was utter bullshit, since I had it checked out not 3 days ago and the mechanics said it was all fine. For the record, I keep my truck in good order since I own it. Many truckers own their cabin, and it's my livelihood down the drain if it ever breaks down. I wasn't carrying any lumber at the time but was still on a deadline, so I had to get on the radio and call ahead to tell the foreman I was going to be late due to issues with my engine. However, when I tried to get through, all I heard back was static. My radio was just as fucked as my truck. Annoyed, I tried adjusting my phone and then realized I was so far out that I wasn't getting any signal out here. So I did the next best thing and decided to try and take a look at it myself. If I could get the truck moving, then I could get it to the camp and have one of the on-site engineers look at it. I barely got out when the smell hit me. This sounds weird, but I could smell rotten meat. It was so thick and strong that I immediately threw up there and then. I turned back towards the truck and was about to climb back in to get a bottle of water when I heard it. That screech that shook me to my core. It was coming from behind me. I turned to look and saw nothing. I knew there was a forest in front of me. I'd been driving through a stretch of forest by this point for a good hour or so. But it was so dark I couldn't see anything past the edge of the road. Then another loud screech came from just ahead of my truck, and again I turned to see what was making the noise. I really wish I hadn't. Standing right there was this monster. That's the best way I can describe it. It was talon skinny and looked as if it had been starving itself. There were these weird antlers on its head that seemed to go everywhere at once. There was very little hair. Instead it had this sort of gray skin that looked to be peeling off everywhere at once. The only reason I could see this much detail is that the headlights on my truck suddenly came on, giving me a very clear look at whatever this thing was. It snarled at me and started coming towards me, but then stopped and turned towards the road ahead of my truck. Another pair of headlights could only mean another vehicle was coming down the road. I took the opportunity to get back into my truck, but by the time I looked back out to where that thing was, it had long since gone. The vehicle approaching just drove past without stopping. It was just a car. My truck suddenly started just as quickly as that thing had vanished. I didn't wait around to find out if it would return. I only mentioned it to in person when I got to the logging camp, to someone I know regularly hunts in these very woods. He told me it was a skinwalker, but I don't even know what that is. All I know is that I never want to see it again.
Story number 42. This is a story my father told me growing up. Now he lived on a reservation with my grandparents, all of them being Navajo. One day when he was 9, a pair of hunters came in Tothy Reservation asking to see the local medicine man. That would be my grandfather at the time. So he went out and saw the pair of them, and then they led him out into the forest just outside their reservation itself. Supposedly he was gone for over 3 days before returning. When my father asked him what happened, my grandfather wouldn't speak of it ever. He actually died never having said a word about the incident. Years later, and my father was now in his mid-20s. He'd gone off to university to study psychology when he ran into my mother, or the woman who'd later become my mother. After they started dating, he went to meet her parents. Surprisingly, her father was one of the hunters, who had come onto the reservation that day years ago, and he recognized my father. He would eventually tell my father what really happened back then. Apparently, him and his brother were hunting for deer, making sure not to trespass on the Indian reservation when they encountered a skinwalker standing over the body of a young girl. They fired a couple of rounds at it, scaring it off and away from the little girl. Sadly, she was already dead, but they both recognized her as the daughter of one of the Indians that lived on their reservation. They immediately took the body back to the tribe, and that's when they called out for me grandfather. He apparently immediately recognized what had done this, and after gathering salt and blessing their weapons with it, I'm not sure if that's the proper term, they set off to kill Skinwalker. The first 2 days they managed to somehow track it before managing to kill it on the third day. My grandfather encouraged the two hunters never to speak of it again, and they would take responsibility for the body. They never found out what happened after that.
Story number 43. I dreamt of skinwalkers long before I actually ever saw one. Well, I say dream. It was always more of a recurring nightmare. In this nightmare, I would find myself on this road surrounded by forest. No matter how far I walked, I would never come across any signs of other people. No cars, no gas stations, nothing. Not even a sign that would tell me where I was. After what felt like hours of walking, I eventually get to a solitary street light just randomly placed out in the middle of nowhere. However, it was always placed in the middle of this road rather than to the side. It was always on, of course, and the light allowed me to see just enough to catch a glimpse of a figure out in the darkness just beyond the reach of the street light opposite of me. I felt compelled to call out, to try and call out for help from this mysterious figure. But then it would turn around as it noticed me and step into the light. What I saw would always make me sick. A tall thing with pale gray skin, a rotten deer's head with a large set of antlers and long gangly arms and legs. I stood there, frozen in fear and sick to my stomach as it started coming towards me. It would eventually reach out to me and grabbed me by the head with one hand, picking me up as the other arm prepared to decapitate me, but I would always wake up right before it actually hit me. The dreams stopped a few years ago when I had my real-life encounter. It was late on Boxing Day and I was driving home after spending Christmas with my parents. I had to start work 3 days after Christmas Day, when my car suddenly stopped. I checked the fuel and I realized I was out of fuel. I had just passed a gas station not 20 minutes prior and had an empty fuel can in me boot, so after retrieving it I started the walk back to the gas station. It took longer than I expected and I started to suspect that the gas station was a little further than I thought when I saw it. Ahead of me was a pair of streetlights. Unlike in my dream, they were placed normally alongside the road, but what I saw lit up was even more horrifying than any nightmare I had previously. Lit up on the road was that thing I saw in my dreams, holding another person. I saw it decapitate him, then turn around and notice me, but with this huge grin on its face and this look in its eyes. Oh God, I'll never forget that look. I don't know how or why, but I just started running back to my car and locked myself inside. What I didn't know at first was that it had followed me and that it saw me lock myself into my car. But I quickly noticed when it tried to approach from behind me. Now, I always carry a handgun in my car, just in case I ever need it, and I did what I thought would be a good idea. I rolled down my window and fired a few shots at it, I think, missing it, but scaring it off for the time being. But it always came back. The weirdest thing was that it never kept the same shape. It would sometimes look like a coyote, or a person or a deer, but it always had the head of a deer, long gangly limbs and that disgusting peleskin that seemed like it was rotting off. Sometimes, though, it moved its mouth as if it were trying to speak to me, but I never actually heard any sounds come from it, whatever it was. Eventually, it seemed to lose interest in me and left the way it came just as the sun started to rise. I stayed in my car for another few hours before making another attempt at finding the gas station. Fortunately, I never saw it again and I'm thankful for that. I never want to see it again.
Story number 44. This happened shortly before I retired as a police officer. I'm not going to mention where it happened or who I am, since I'd rather not be hounded about it, but I do feel the need to share it somewhere and this seems like the right place. So, a few months before I retired I was patrolling some back-end country roads just outside the town I was in. It was easy enough work, not much in way of trouble, and very rarely was any trouble worth more work than a ticket or what. You know, simple stuff like some dumbass teens thinking the roads were perfect for forgetting the speed limit or someone having a broken tail light. It was easy enough work and honestly I preferred spending the last few months of my working life with a bit of peace and quiet, especially after spending so many years serving the police force. But this one incident, it stuck with me and I doubt I'd ever forget it. Now, this all started with the disappearance of a local native kid who ran away from home. His father turned out to be a real prick towards his kid, so I hardly blame the kid for running. Thing is, he was found a few days after being reported missing. Unfortunately, he was found dead in the woods, apparently mauled to death by a wild animal. It happens sometimes, especially around here since we have a fair few coyotes packs. The reason I bring this up is because it turns out the kid was actually close to this woman known for being weird. She lived out in those woods and rarely interacted with anyone else. But she and the kid were close and one of my colleagues saw fit to ask her if she saw him after he went missing. He came back and said she denied ever even knowing him, a lie since everyone knew about his frequent visits to her shack. But since his death was ruled as a result of an animal attack, no one ever followed up on her. Until my encounter. This happened a week after the kid was found. I was on night patrol near the forest where he was found and the woman livid when I got a report of a traffic collision a few miles from my location. Since I was the closest I was called to the scene as first responder. As expected, I was first on the scene. The car was there and I immediately noticed the blood on the front bumper and all over the road. At first I thought a guy struck an animal and called it and thinking he hit someone. That's when I noticed no one was around. The driver had seemingly gone off somewhere, probably running from the scene. I was about to call it and when I heard someone scream from the forest, right side of myself, and me training immediately kicked in. I pulled my gun and flashlight after calling in what had just happened and went straight to where the sound was. It took less than 5 minutes to find the source. It was who I presumed was the driver of the car, lying on the ground covered in blood with it standing over him. It is of course the Skinwalker. I only knew about them from local legends up until this point. It looked like a twisted amalgamation of a human and a coyote, and frankly smelled like it was rotting. It was covered in blood and was snarling at me to go away. It actually spoke in this unnatural way. I fired 2 shots at it when it tried to make a move towards me, but neither shot seemed to stop it despite hitting the damn thing. I fired another 2 shots, before it raised its head to look behind me and running off. Another 2 patrol cars had arrived and had heard my gunshots. All 4 men had seen that thing just as it ran away, with 3 of them going to pursue whatever it was. The other and I stayed to secure the body of the driver. He was already dead. Long story short, the 3 officers chased that thing down to the old lady's shack, where it supposedly transformed back into the woman and was promptly killed. I don't know what really happened, since none of them would really talk about it. But a journal found not long after seemed to convince the higher-ups that she had been responsible for the death of the kid as well as the driver. The whole Skinwalker part though? Quietly hidden from public records. The official reports were made to blame her and her dog on the deaths. I don't miss being an officer after remembering that case and a few others from earlier in my career.
Story number 45. I live in the UK now, but I grew up in West Virginia. The reason I live in the UK now is because of the 2 encounters I had with a skinwalker when I was younger. The first encounter happened when I was 10. My grandfather owned a corn farm back 20 years ago when the first encounter happened. The reason why me and my parents were there was for a big family gathering to celebrate the birthday of one of my aunts. Now, it's important to note that my grandfather's farm had 3 parts to it. There was the house itself with the road leading up to it, the large cornfields, and then a small patch of wooded area that separated the far side of the cornfield with the nearby neighbors. Me and my two cousins were playing in the wooded area, fighting with sticks and other shit you'd expect a 10, 9 and 6-year-old to do, when we heard me mom calling us from the house. My two cousins immediately ran towards the house, and I was about to follow them when I thought I could hear my father calling for me from the other side of the wooded area. This wasn't strange since him and my grandfather liked to hunt and around there since it was a popular feeding spot for deer. The small pond probably didn't hurt either. So of course I started going to where I thought he was. I got past this large rock when I heard my father again, but this time coming from the rock I just passed. I was a little confused, Thaddeus, until I turned around and saw it. This 9-foot-tall monster looking right at me. It was tall, had pale skin that was flaking off, and antlers on top of a grotesque head that snarled at me. The image is forever burned into my mind. Even more after it lunged at me. That's the last thing I remember that day. This horrific monster lunging at me. I was later told that my father came out looking for me and found me laying unconscious on the floor covered in blood, this thing carrying me in its arms. He took a warning shot which caused the monster to drop me and run off. I was covered in blood, but was somehow uninjured. My second encounter happened 2 years later. By then, the wooded area had been cleared and turned into a pig farm owned and ran by my grandfather. The problem was some of his pigs were going missing and he suspected coyotes were somehow getting to them. So my parents and I moved to the farm during summer break so my father and grandfather could try and track down the animals responsible for taking pigs. This happened about a week after we moved in. For obvious reasons, I wouldn't near to here the wooded area used to be. Instead I was happy just walking through the cornfield towards the old barn even though I knew I wasn't allowed there. I didn't go far however before the smell hit me. It was similar to the smell of that monster from 2 years before. I tried to dismiss it as just nerves playing tricks with my mind or some stupid shit like that, right up until I saw it. It was the monster that had attacked me before. But it hadn't noticed me. It took everything I had not to make a sound as I tried to back away. It was only when it stood up from its crouch that I screamed and ran as fast as I could back to the house. I barged into the door and did my best to tell my father about seeing it again through all the crying. To this day, I wish I stopped him and my grandfather from leaving. They both grabbed their hunting rifles and went to find it, but they never returned. We never found out what happened to them. 6 months after that, my mother and I moved to England where she was from, and to this day I refuse to return to West Virginia. I never want to see that monster again.
Story number 46. I live in a small town in South Carolina, and as you might expect, it's as boring as hell. I, however, spend a lot of my time camping, so it never really bothered me. Well, this particular camping trip took place in a popular campsite that was closed for the winter. It closed between the months of October through to March, and this happened late November, and it's something that has stuck with me ever since. I got my tent, a small stove, the rest of the camping equipment I needed, and permission from the owner of the campsite, a good friend of mine, and quickly set up for an overnight stay near to a community hall-like building usually reserved for parties and the like. It was going well. It was only around after it got dark when strange things began to happen. For one, I started to hear wolf howls. That was a new one to me. Not really. I grew up in Cali before moving. Since there are no wolves in South Carolina, it didn't really alarm me since it sounded like they were way off, but it did have me curious as to how wolves got this far east. I listened to the howls for about another hour before I decided to try and get some sleep, but that didn't last too long. I don't know how long it was watching me for, but I was woken up by the howl of a wolf coming from the nearby community hall. It was, as I thought at the time, a single wolf. Looking back, I wasn't as scared as I should have been, and that was probably because of the gun I had on me. Minutes went by and I didn't hear anything, and I assumed it and moved on when I heard it. A low voice coming from just outside my tent. "I know you're in there," it said. "Why don't you come on out so we can meet properly?" For some reason I just froze up in fear. I can't explain it, but something about that voice just had me all locked up. "Don't keep waiting, friend," it said through the tent. But I couldn't move. I wanted to reach for my gun, but I just couldn't reach it despite it being right next to me. "Oh, come now, friend. You don't need the gun. It wouldn't work on me anyway, friend." Hearing that was the worst part. Or would have been had it not immediately followed up by howling exactly like the wolf and started sniffing Thated. This went on for the rest of the night. To this day, I'm glad it didn't decide to just tear through my tent, and have no desire to find out why it didn't do that.
Story number 47. This is an encounter I had in 1975, a few months after I returned home from Vietnam. Simply put, I was starting to grow tired of living in New York City after spending several years in that shithole war and decided I'd rather go out and live by myself for a while. This led me to living in the absolute wilderness of Texas, far from where the ranchers and really anyone else would go. Living rough wasn't an issue for me, obviously. Anything is better than having your ass handed to you by enemy forces, so all I had during that period of time was a small wood axe, a handgun and a few boxes of matches and ammo to see me through my self-imposed exile. For a short while, everything seemed okay. I was finally able to get my thoughts together and make some sort of attempt to deal with everything that happened during the war. But then I started to notice someone occasionally walking through the particular area I chose to stay in. Thing is, I had chosen one of the most isolated parts of Texas since I didn't want to chance encountering someone and having to play nice, so seeing someone this far out was a little concerning to me. Problem was, the few attempts I made in following them always ended up with me running into a pack of coyotes, or somehow losing them despite the relatively flat and open area we were in. A month after I started seeing this person, I started hearing screams at night. But not screams of terror, I know what they sound like. Instead, it sounded like someone was trying to scare me away from a distance, or perhaps warning me that they were coming after me. The screams were always followed by coyote howls and I only ever heard the screams at night. For very obvious reasons I was starting to consider leaving the area and returning to New York and what little family I had left there, but then the incident happened and I guess the decision was made for me. I'm talking about my encounter with it. To this day I'm not entirely sure what it was, but looking back with what I know now, I have a few guesses. This happened first week of October, on what would ultimately be my last night in Texas. It had already gotten dark by this point and I was expecting another night of hearing those damned screams. First thing I notice now is that I never heard a sound. There were no screams, at least none that I can remember. It was quiet, right up until it came into my camp. I'd barely slept and had no real desire to do so, so I just sat by the campfire I'd made when I saw something approach. At first I was relieved at it just being another coyote. It wouldn't bother with me since it was probably just curious about the fire and the smell of the meat I was cooking. I ignored it assuming it would just wander off, that is until it started getting closer to the fire. That's when I noticed its matted farand gray and flaky skin. It looked ill, hell on a closer look it barely looked like a coyote at all. It got close to the fire, turned to me and then smiled. Then it stood up on its hind legs and walked through the fire towards me, still smiling at me. The look in its eyes changed from curiosity to sort of malevolent intent someone wears only when they intend to kill someone. Instead of screaming like I assume it thought I would, I lifted my handgun and emptied a full clip into whatever the fuck it was. After emptying the clip in my gun, I turned to grab my axe and turned back to see that it had gone. There was ash and still burning embers that followed it trail towards me and then back the way it came. I don't know how, but it must have moved faster than anything I've ever seen to be able to disappear that quickly. I didn't take a chance at seeing whatever that thing was and left that night. I stayed in New York for a while before moving to Japan. For all the things I saw in Vietnam that have stayed with me, I don't think anything could compare to what I saw that night in Texas and I refuse to forget it.
Story number 48. Once upon a time, I had a great uncle who lived out in Nevada with his wife and 2 kids. This was in the late 1800s and they were practically on the frontier. Something that I guess seemed really appealing to them. Anyway, they often had trouble with all the usual groups you'd expect them to deal with, from bandits to Native Americans. This meant that early on they were forced to move around a lot due to those reasons alone, let alone any number of other issues they had to face. Eventually, however, they did manage to settle down on a piece of land not too far from where the frontier met what was then the US border and they got a farm going. This next part is mostly just family legend, though I like to imagine it's somewhat true. You see, the land they settled on was said to be considered evil land or taboo land for the Native Americans of Theria, since their legends spoke of evil spirits that inhabited that particular stretch of land. They still had the occasional issues with bandits and the like, but since it was far from being the true frontier it ended up being the sort of problem solved with a few rounds of ammo and a quick trip into the nearest town to collect a small bounty. Content with their new home and no longer having to deal with bandits or Native Americans, my great-uncle and his family did pretty well for themselves for a few years before the events surrounding his death happened. By events, I mean a series of short encounters with what can only be described as a skinwalker if the family legend is accurate. It began one autumn during the harvest when my great-uncle began seeing a Native American woman on the edge of his property. That in itself was weird since they never came onto that piece of land, though he guessed she was one of the many outcasts that had been rumored to be wandering around that part of the U.S. Regardless, she'd never stay long and would often flee upon spotting and being spotted by my great-uncle. Then things started to get stranger, and not in the good way. They started to get concerned over the increasing coyote and mountain lion activity in the area, which for obvious reasons pushed thoughts about that strange woman to one side. My great-uncle raised cattle for a living, so the biggest concern was that coyotes or mountain lions would begin picking off his cattle one by one. Being the rancher that was, him and his eldest son began hunting the predators and would occasionally kill a few mountain lions. Weirdest thing was that they never came across any coyotes despite hearing them all the time. What they would see often enough was the woman from the edge of the property and a handful of other Native American women, most of whom looked elderly and ragged. They would tend to keep to themselves and avoid my great-uncle and his son, fleeing anytime they encountered them. This continued well into winter, right up until the first incident happened. After a few months of searching, my great-uncle finally saw a coyote in one of the valleys near his farm. He raised his gun, took aim and shot the animal, but despite what he considered a clean kill he was unable to find the body. There was plenty of blood, sure, but it looked as though the body just up and vanished. That night, several of his cattle went missing. There was a mix-off coyote and human tracks with the blame obviously falling to the Native American women had been seeing. He came to the belief that they'd been somehow raising coyotes like most people do with dogs and that's why they hadn't seen any until recently. Over the following weeks, more cattle would disappear until only a handful were left despite many attempts by my great-uncle to keep the women and coyotes from getting to them. It came to a head when he was out searching for them one day. He saw a group of them and fired a few shots towards them and supposedly hit them. Even though he didn't mean to actually shoot any of them, having the intentions of simply scaring them off, he just hoped it would mean they would avoid his farm from then on out. That night, they came not for the cattle but for him. From what his wife and two sons would later describe, a group of Native American women surrounded their homestead and demanded him to come out. Seeing that they were just a bunch of unarmed women, he obviously came out and started shooting at them in an attempt to scare them off while his wife and two sons stayed inside. They watched helplessly from the windows as the women turned from elderly-looking women into tall monsters with gray skin and monstrous teeth and horns before proceeding to tear him apart. He tried shooting them before ultimately deciding to try and get back inside, but they were too fast and got to him before he even had a chance to realize what was going on. After killing him, they continued to stalk the homestead until dawn, seemingly expecting one of the others to come out and help my great-uncle. Neither the two sons or the wife wanted to go outside with them out there and were frozen in fear inside the building itself. When the sun rose that following morning, the women/monsters all left, leaving the mauled body of my great-uncle behind with his frightened and traumatized family. They very quickly packed what valuables they had and left that day, never to return, and chose to return to England where my great-uncle was from. The legend has been passed down the family ever since.
Story number 49. I learned a long time ago that skinwalkers are not something to be trifled with. Quite the opposite in fact. They are terrifying and dangerous. My encounter happened in Oklahoma a few years back. I was working for this construction crew and we'd been hired to do some work on this cabin some rich dick wanted renovating. Simple enough work in that it was just some new inner walls, new insulation, a new roof and some solar panels for off-grid power. Other than being in the middle of literal nowhere, it wasn't difficult work. It was 2 weeks work and solid pay, so it wasn't much of an issue with us. That came on the third day of work. One of the guys in the crew, Jamie, was already there. That was odd on its own since he was always late, but what made it even odder was the way he was acting throughout the day. Then he just upped and disappeared around lunchtime. Again, that itself was odd since he normally worked through lunch, so we didn't expect him to just disappear. Me and another one from the crew, Barry, went off to find him while the rest got on with the work. We went to the trucks but couldn't find him. And we were about to make our way back to the shed when Barry pointed something out. There was a trail of blood leading from the trucks into the forest. Obviously, we thought something happened to Jamie and followed the trail. It didn't take us long to find out what happened to him. We found his body. From the looks of it, he had been there all night. Barry almost threw up at the smell of the body. I was about to tell him to run back and get the others when I heard Jake call out to us. But he was laying dead in front of us. Then Barry screamed and I saw why. Standing in front of us was some twisted version of Jamie. It didn't look right or natural. It had his face, but it was all pasty and flaking off. There were horns on its head and it had this open smile that showed fangs rather than normal human teeth. It was horrifying. It just stood there, staring at us while drooling. Neither of us are scared easily, but both me and Barry started running the moment it started walking towards us. Not 15 minutes we returned with the rest of the crew and a few guns we kept in the trucks. That fucking thing was still there, eating Jamie. I was carrying one of the guns as was our boss. We both fired a few rounds at it, but it didn't even notice them. Then the chief said something I couldn't quite make out before firing another shot. It was hit and went down before getting up, howling/screaming at us before running away on all fours. It was still wearing his face through all of this. Jamie had been torn to shreds and his teeth was eventually ruled as an animal attack, but to this day I wouldn't consider whatever thing was an animal. I'd later ask the chief what he said before taking the shot, but he would refuse to ever talk about it. We managed to complete the renovations without any more issues, but I later found out that the guy who owned it went missing during a stay at the cabin. I never went to see that thing again.
Story number 50. I've always enjoyed camping in places where people ought not to go. Caves no one but me can get to, cliffs considered too dangerous by other experienced climbers, and I even spent a night on top of Mount Everest. To say I make sometimes undeniably stupid decisions is an understatement. But this one time really had me fucked. There's this bit of land in Arizona that is said to have belonged to some Native American tribe some time ago. It's really barren, but there is this old house on there that seems to have been abandoned for decades, if not longer. I'd long planned to stay there for a bit, and since the pandemic has kept everyone indoors, I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to spend a week there. August comes round and I make my way to that old house. I enter through the front door and see it. There's a coyote just inside. Great. He didn't know there were coyotes in the area. I slowly back out and away from it, right up until it stood on its hind legs. This fucking coyote stood up onto its hind legs. Then it talked. "I've been waiting for you, Julie. Why don't you come on in?" I screamed and started running. I got maybe 200 yards away from the house before tripping over. I looked behind me and saw it leaving the house. It didn't look like a coyote anymore. This is hard to explain, but it looked as if it were turning into me. I didn't stay to get a good look as I got up and ran the 1.5 miles back to my car. I'd hiked to the house. I managed to get away and never saw it again. But then again, I'm never going back to that house again either.
Story number 51. I fought a skinwalker and somehow survived. This happened 10 years ago when I was staying with my then girlfriend out in Texas. We were staying at this farmhouse owned by her father, hoping to get it back in shape after years of being left to the elements. It began stalking us almost as soon as we arrived, in that it took the form of a coyote and began following us everywhere whenever we left the farmhouse. If I went to the old barn, it was there. If my girlfriend went to the old well and pump, it'd follow her too. We didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a normal coyote that was overly friendly. I should have shot it while I had the chance. 3 nights in and shit hit the fan hard. We were about to hunker down for the night when this weird sickening scream moved through the house and into the bedroom we were staying in. It was almost unnatural in the way it moved, like the very sound itself had a mind of its own. Then we heard a knocking at the front door and a thin raspy voice spoke out. "Oh, you portiers, I hope I didn't scare you. Let me in and I can apologize properly." It wasn't a natural voice. It sounded like one of those old voice recorders where it's obvious it's not a human speaking. My girlfriend wanted to go see who it was, not wanting to believe it couldn't be anything other than a human. I stopped her and told her that whatever that thing was clearly wasn't human. I mean, that scream followed by that unnatural voice. Something was outside wanting in. She just looked at me with this face as she realized what I meant by it. "Oh, please do hurry up, dears, it's awfully cold out here." It was the same voice and my girlfriend immediately recognized it. "That's my grandmother," she told me, "but she died years ago." We both started to panic when whatever it was started banging on the front door to the house. It was loud enough that it seemed to be coming from the bedroom door, let alone the other side of the building. Then another ear-piercing scream shot through the house, followed by more pounding on the outer walls and doors. We started to panic as we didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but realized there wasn't any reception this far out and there weren't any landlines installed either. Running to the car wasn't an option. We still didn't know what that thing was and I didn't want to find out if we could outrun it. Then we heard a window smash in one of the rooms below, followed by yet another blood-curdling scream. It was inside. I don't know why I did this, but I forced my girlfriend to hide under the bed before running out of the room and down the stairs. Sure enough, one of the kitchen windows had been smashed in as if someone or something was attempting to get through it. Below the smashed window was some table salt that had spilled over. It had clearly tried to get in, but I couldn't see it anywhere. It was only then did I see it outside the window, looking back at me. It was tall enough that it had to bend down to look through the window back at me, where it looked at me with the eyes that glowed a deep red. It smiled at me, showing its razor-sharp teeth, before speaking, "Oh dearie me, I seem to have made a mess. Be a dear and let me in so I can clean it up for you." I just froze in that spot, scared out of my mind at this thing I was staring at. I just stood there as it tried to make another attempt at climbing through the window, but stopped as it noticed the spilled salt blocking its way. I don't really know why, but something in me put two and two together and ran towards it, grabbed the container of salt and started throwing salt at the monster in front of me. It screamed as the salt hit it and ran off into the darkness. Its screaming snapped me out of it, and I immediately ran back upstairs to make sure my girlfriend was okay. We spent the rest of tonight locked inside the bedroom, praying it would never come back. We still have the farm, but have never gone back. Neither of us want to talk about it, but I just can't get that night out of my head. I am never going to forget what happened.
Story number 52. There was a story I heard years back when I was still a kid. For the record, I grew up in a small town in Ohio where weird shit like this tends to be the norm, though growing up no one really thought much of it. It started when a family who owned a ranch just outside of town suddenly sold the property and moved away, which itself was odd since there didn't really seem to be any reason for the sudden change. The new owners moved in and about a week later disappeared without a trace, leaving the property abandoned. This all happened when I was too young to actually remember any of it, though obviously everybody knew about the property and the rumors of skinwalkers driving the old owners out on top of being the cause of the new owners disappearing. No one actually believed it until a few years ago, when a bunch of high school kids decided to stay the night at the property. Apparently, they thought it a good idea to stay in the barn, despite or perhaps because of all the more recent rumors of people going missing on or near the property. They didn't disappear. At first, they returned to school over the next few days, but acted weird. It was like they weren't even the same people. A few kids disappeared before this specific group decided they wanted to return to the property. They never came back. These being high school kids, a search and rescue op was sent out to look for them. The weird thing was, many of those sent out to look for them thought they could hear them or see them for brief moments whenever they searched in or near the property. They eventually did find all the kids that went missing, but unfortunately they had all been killed in what looked like a wild animal attack. To this day it's widely regarded as a confirmed skinwalker attack by most everyone, myself included. I mean, it so as hell fits with the legends surrounding the skinwalkers,